Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk about do-ocratic communities. And we are,
So I am Anne. I am a human rights activist. I used to do some community management and policy making for an NGO in the nonprofit sector. Yeah, always, and it's
and I'm Merlin. I'm part of the Snapcrafters team. I'm an Ubuntu Community Council member, and as my day job, I teach at Ghent University, and I do research at IMEC. But I want to make something very clear. These are my personal views. They in no way reflect an official Ubuntu position or an official Ubuntu Community Council position. We are just here to talk a bit about what our thoughts are. And if other people are interested, then maybe they become more broader thoughts. But right now, this is just our position. These are our ideas. So first, we're going to talk about why we actually want diversity in our community, because this is a question that I actually get asked quite often, why it is important to have more diversity. Then we'll talk about what meritocracy is and its impact on the communities, what a do-ocracy is and its impact on communities. And then we'll have a little bit of fun by explaining why the Ubuntu Code of Conduct is actually lying to us. And then we'll conclude the talk.
so another kind of side note, but I think it's very important to say. We did describe it as diversity, but I really like the slogan, nothing about us without us. So I'm mainly going to focus on women in tech because that's something I can personally speak to. But I do think this is an open invitation, and we have a few examples of broader diversity. So I would really like to warmly invite everyone to participate in this discussion and also note that a lot of these things do apply for people with all types of backgrounds, for people with disability, all of these things. But we mainly focus on women because I know from experience what it's like. So I could actually really underline the data better because I know it by heart. So first of all, some numbers. Representation in tech jobs versus general population. These are Canadian numbers. So we do find them relatively comparative to most countries. But I will say there is a big difference. And I think Canada is still one of the better places when it comes to representation within tech. That said, we have 35.8% women versus a 51% in general population. This means that you would think that if there's 51% women in general population, that there would be 51% in representation in these jobs. That's not true. We see it's 30%. It's 3.5% people with disability. And the general population is 23% people with disability. When we look at LGBTQA+, then we see actually a positive correlation where there's about 10% representation within the tech sector, where in general population it's about 4%. So we also do have a big representation of LGBTQ+, but I do want to note all of these tech jobs that I mentioned here, they also include design, they also include the creative side of tech jobs and also human resources related to tech jobs. And we do notice that representation of LGBTQ plus and women is a lot bigger within HR and a lot bigger in the creative side of these tech jobs. So even though it's 35%, it does not mean that 35% of all developers are women right now. So if you place that 35.8 in tech jobs against open source, it all of a sudden drops to 10%. That's not a great sign. In open source communities, 10% of contributions are women. I find that very telling. I think it tells us that in open source, we have even more work to do. I do want to say, as a positive kind of note, in 2006, it was only 1.5%. So we've grown, but I don't think we've grown enough. So why do we care about diversity? So reason one, diversity actually creates a better product. We have a lot of examples of products that were not great because there was a lack of diversity in development. So we have Siri, and if you would tell Siri in 2011, "Hey Siri, you're a bitch," she would reply with, "I blush if I could." I can tell you personally, women do not reply that way to that. Maybe if we're really scared of you, we might. But this is not a good representation of what a person would say. And it's very obvious that this voice assistant is coded feminine. And I do think we have to think about what that makes of us, that we find it normal that somebody who sounds feminine reacts very coy to this. I also put in the example of Alexa because it's not just specifically Apple. It's like in general, voice assistants have this issue. She would reply with, "Well, thanks for the feedback. This is not great." And I think if they actually consulted a woman, they might have known that we don't love that. The second example is a truly dark one. I'm so sorry. Google had a chat feature they wanted to implement, and they asked all of their users to please use their real name. Because when this feature was implemented, all of the Google profiles of this person were merged. But this meant for trans women, for example, that all of a sudden that name, their old name, was presented in their chat feature. And so a lot of trans women and trans men got outed at their jobs. This is horrific because maybe like just on a personal level, it's up to the person to be ready to say these kinds of things. But also there's a lot of places where you can still get fired for this. And sadly, one person that we know of took their lives because they were involuntarily outed due to this system. Eventually, Google solved this issue and they let you take on another name. But it shouldn't come to the point where we do such obvious harm in a community. The last example is a pretty famous one as well. It's a bit older. It's Google Photos, had face recognition software. And this Twitter user brought to the attention that for some reason they and their friends were tagged as gorillas. This was because the recognition software was not trained upon all different skin tones, as well as it was on white skin tones. So we had a implicit like racist face recognition. Again, it shows how important it is to like truly make our software diverse, so we don't have these types of mistakes. An example of how this can be better, Mastodon was really made with a lot of diverse people in the team, but also a lot of the concerns of diverse people in mind. How do we keep our community safe from hate speech? How do we protect users? How do we stop harassment? These types of things were very central to the core of this application. And I think as a user, you feel this. It creates a durable and sustainable, diverse platform. The second reason is less about the product. This is more about the empowerment of the contributors themselves. I think it's pretty amazing what community we have here. And actually, being part of open source it can change our lives. It can give us more job opportunity. It can create digital literacies. Um, it's just a generally good thing to be part of a community and part of a world where you're learning a lot of technical stuff that you actually apply in a way broader sense. So it's so good to be part of this community that we should actually really try to include everyone. So maybe we can even combat some of the structural or systematic inequalities.
So um, now to governance structures. Meritocracy is more or less the default governance structure in open source. But what is it exactly? Well, if you look at Wikipedia, for example, it says that meritocracy is sort of political power is vested in individuals based on their ability and talent rather than wealth and class. Um, this seems like a very nice idea. The idea that those with the most merit decide what should be done and how it should be done. Advancement in such a system is based on performance as measured in a certain way. And the Ubuntu Code of Conduct mentions meritocracy a few times. And it says specifically, we delegate decision-making, governance, and leadership from senior bodies to the most able and engaged candidates. So according to the Code of Conduct, Ubuntu is a clear meritocracy. But then there's a question about what merit actually is. Meritocracy is the idea that the people with the most merit get to make decisions and get to do things. But what does merit mean exactly? Well, theoretically, the ideal is that merit actually means competence for that specific task. The right person does the job. However, in reality, often a proxy gets used. Instead of competence, people simply look at seniority. The person who contributed the most is the person with the most merit. And you see that even in countries which are heavily based in meritocracy, there also competence is taking a backseat to actual seniority. And I'm not talking about how old a person is, but I'm talking about the sort of social credit that a person has earned in a community by doing things inside of that community. There's a couple of issues with meritocracy, and we can divide them based on whether you're looking at meritocracy as like the ideal competence-based meritocracy or the seniority-based meritocracy. So let's first take a look at the competence-based meritocracy. One of the main issues in open source communities is burnout. It's not only an issue in having people almost go through people and have them not contribute to the community anymore. But it's also a big source of conflict in the community are people who are either burnt out or very close to burning out and don't have the energy anymore to communicate in a respectful manner. Because in such a meritocratic community, competence gets rewarded with more work. Because the most competent people are the people who decide the most and who do the most, they get rewarded with the most work. And so competent people, they keep rising through the ranks. And if they don't have like a built-in system to know when to say no and to keep saying no, then they will burn out. Another issue is the barrier of entry. And we're talking about both a real barrier to entry and a perceived one. The real one is simply that in order to contribute to the community, you need to have certain competences in order to even get in. So how do you get these competences if you're not already in the community? And then the second one is maybe even the bigger one. It's the perceived one. For example, if you look at um, pull requests from women, percentage-wise, there's a lot less pull requests from women. However, if you look at how many of those pull requests actually get accepted, it's a lot higher percentage-wise. Almost all of them get accepted. So this actually means that women in our community, for some reason, have a lot more contributions that they don't actually share, that they don't actually push upstream, because they view their view of their own competency, their view of the value and how well written out some of their contributions are, is quite low. And because of that, they don't dare to submit as much pull requests if they're not 100% certain about the quality of that pull request. Interestingly, if you listen to Nathan's keynote at the first day of this conference, this is an issue that's not only holding back a lot of diverse people, but it's also holding back a lot of other non-diverse people, simply because a lot of people in our community have some form of imposter syndrome, have some form of a negative view on their own accomplishments, on their own achievements. And then if you explicitly tell everybody, this community is a community that's based on meritocracy, you need competence in order to be able to contribute, only the best will succeed here, then those kind of people, they are very afraid to actually join. And so we're losing a lot of people, both in diversity and outside of diversity. We're losing a lot of people that simply don't enter our community because of this barrier of entry. And then this creates a vicious cycle. People keep burning out because there's not enough people here, and because it's very hard for people to get into it. And people who can't get into it don't think that they have the right competences, can't build those competences, and so they never actually join. Then I also talked about the second issue of issues with the seniority-based approach of meritocracy, which is what most meritocracies are actually in the real world. One of the big issues is change resistance, for the simple reason that the people who are at the top are most often the people for whom the system and the community has worked the best. And so often these people simply have a lot of blind spots about what is it as an experience to be in this community for somebody who for whom the system does not work. A great example of this is the process to get a code of conduct in the Linux project. In order to get this code of conduct in Linux, people actually had to go through Linus Torvalds. Linus Torvalds is somebody for whom the system works really well. And so in order to get a code of conduct in the Linux project, people for whom the system did not work really well had to go to Linus Torvalds, had to convince him, first of all, that there is an issue. Convincing somebody that there is an issue who is simply blind to the things that he has never experienced, which is normal. It's completely normal to be blind to the things that you have never experienced. And then second of all, they had to convince him that a code of conduct is a good way to actually solve this issue. So change resistance, a big issue with seniority-based meritocracies. Another issue is the ability to invest. So Anne showed the numbers that even if you compare the diversity in open source with the diversity in tech, we're still doing worse. Well, research actually found that one of the reasons for this is that becoming an open source contributor and becoming a prominent member in the community requires a lot of free time, a lot of initial investment of free time. And in this society, women in general have a lot less free time than men. Because in this society, in general, women take on a lot more of the household duties. Women spend a lot more time with the kids. And as a result, it's a lot more difficult for women to actually come into this community because they don't have that much time to invest.
Yeah, it's the idea of free labor, where women are sometimes culturally expected to take on a lot of emotional responsibility, a lot of care responsibility. It's not a super universal thing. It depends on the culture, but we see when it comes to the data, like the the strong data, we still see this big difference in amount of free time between the sexes.
Then there's the other issue of assumed authority. In a meritocracy, you're not judged on your actual abilities, you're judged on how other people see your abilities. And if you want to have an idea of how it is, as how your abilities are perceived as a diverse person, just talk to Karen Sandler. Karen Sandler is the director of the Software Freedom Conservancy. Software Freedom Conservancy is a really cool organization that helps a lot of open source projects. So Karen Sandler is the director. Bradley Kuhn is one of the members of the Software Freedom Conservancy. When those two people are in a meeting together with companies, with organizations, in order to talk about stuff, everybody is looking at Bradley. Everybody is talking to Bradley and trying to convince Bradley, even though Karen Sandler is actually the director of the Conservancy. And this is something that women,
Why do you point at me?
this is something that women experience a lot, not only in the open source community, but in any field of business.
Yeah. Also, if you have questions after this talk to me, not to him. He doesn't know anything. He's just a pretty boy. I'm obviously kidding.
So this, in the title of the talk, is do-ocracy. So let me talk a bit about what is do-ocracy and why do we think it might help to solve some of these issues. But it's definitely not a magic wand to fix everything. But we think that there's some interesting ideas in there to solve some of the issues. The idea of do-ocracy is that if you do a task, you decide how it should be done. It's basically a wordplay on democracy and meritocracy. Instead of having the most skilled person decide something, the person who actually does it will decide it. There's a lot of interesting things in a do-ocracy. For example, you don't need the opinion of everybody who is affected by your actions. It's the idea of ask for forgiveness instead of for permission. However, that means that your actions need to be revertible. You can't use do-ocracy to tear down a building, and when the building is torn down, then say, oops, sorry. No, if you tear down a building, you need to use some formal consensus building mechanism in order to figure out whether or not people will actually agree with that. Often people don't really assume that in a do-ocracy there is authority, but there is authority in a do-ocracy. There is authority by doing. Because you are doing something, you get authority over that thing. And you lose authority by stop doing something. And so as long as you're still doing it, for example, you build a certain tool, as long as you're still working on that tool, you become the authoritative figure of that tool. And people need to come to you in order to update it, in order to change it. But if you stop doing that, if you disappear, then people are free to take it over. So, as a short reiteration, meritocracy means the most competent person decides. In a do-ocracy, the person who does it decides. Do-ocracy is a very common concept in hackerspaces. Hackerspaces are physical places where people dedicated to creative and constructive tinkering meet and do really cool stuff and hang out. It's focused on science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, but the main focus is the technology and engineering side. It's a very chaotic community, very founded in counterculture, loosely connected, and has been growing steadily since the 1980s. The European part of it is founded in is branched out of the Chaos Communication Club, a big German hackerspace. In the entire world, there's at least 901 active hackerspaces combined, and a very big part of them use do-ocracy. And that's also where my own experience with do-ocracy comes from. In the past, I used to be a board member of Hackerspace Ghent, and I did a creative community building exercise to find a better way to run our community. We created the Hackerspace Blueprint, which is a living document that describes how to build a community using do-ocracy. If you're interested in learning more about do-ocracy, go to that URL, hackerspace.design. Do-ocracies are very useful even beyond hackerspaces, and the website has a lot of general information even beyond hackerspaces. And it also has a lot of other presentations about leaderless community building and leaderless conflict resolution. But let's talk about do-ocracy in open source. Nathan Haynes, during the community Q&A yesterday, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but he said something like, if you want to do something, you don't actually need permission. If you think it needs to be done, then just do it, because that's how open source works. And a lot of people inside of our community, once they start contributing, they figure out that that's actually the case. And this sounds a lot like a do-ocracy. So the empowerment of the do-ocracy is that once you're part of our community, you see how much impact you can simply have simply by doing something without having a merit, without having a formal education, without having official backing. There's so many projects that have no official backing, but that are still having an incredibly positive influence on our community. But it's not clear from the outside, because the code of conduct is actually lying to us. When people want to learn about the Ubuntu community, they go to the documentation and they read, oh, we are a meritocracy, from senior bodies to the most able and engaged candidates. But if that's the case, then where did the Ubuntu Hangouts come from? Because our official communication tool is still IRC. Where did the Yaru team come from? Because Canonical wasn't interested in that. Where did the new Ubuntu store come from? If you go through the commit history, Canonical is just one of the contributors. It was never decided by the Ubuntu Developers Board to create a new store. Where did Telegram come from? A lot of us are using Telegram at this conference to talk to each other. These are things that have not been decided with some sort of authority. These are things that have been created by just random people in our community who wanted to do something. They started doing something. A lot of other people thought it was really cool, and so they joined in. And this is actually how you change things in our community. We are a silent do-ocracy. We're a do-ocracy, but we don't talk about it. And this is a big issue. This is a big issue, and we've known for a long time that stuff like this is an issue. The Tyranny of Structurelessness, it's an essay written by Jo Freeman. She was a feminist during the early feminist movement of the 1970s. And she wrote an essay about the issues with a community that don't formally define how the community works and what the structure is of the community. Because we are all humans. We're all programmed as social creatures, and every single time humans come together, we create a social structure. You can't say this is anarchy, there's no social structure. There always is one. Whether or not you want to make it explicit or not. But if you don't make it explicit, then you have a big issue of unaccountable leaders. If it's not clear who the actual leader is, if it's not written down, then you can't say, oh, the leadership here made a bad decision. Because then the people who actually make the decisions can easily just say, oh, but yeah, this is anarchy. I'm not an actual leader.
This is what we all decided.
Yes. There's also a big difficulty in actually start contributing, because before you know how to contribute in the community, you have to know who you need to poke, who you need to talk to in order to get actual things done. And so you create an organization with an incredible in crowd. The people who are inside of the organization, for them, the system works because they know how it is, but it's incredibly difficult to get into it. And it's even more difficult if you have limited time to spend on getting to know the organization.
I might have a good analogy. Um, so you're 10 minutes late to a cooking class, let's say, and everybody is just running around doing stuff, and you are not sure how to join the class, but you also know you want to join the class, but everybody's just doing things. And it's like, oh, you can do whatever you want. But it's obvious that people had instructions when you were not there. And there's already this code between the students like, oh, he's doing the dessert, he's doing entrees. I don't know. I've never been. Um, but like everybody has this code, this structure, you have the social unspoken rules, and then all of a sudden as a newcomer you have to decide like, oh, where do I fit in? And you have to ask the right people, and maybe one of them is cooking the dessert and you go to them and you ask like, oh, what can I do? And this person is really annoyed with you because you just made their parfait um, fail or something, and they lash out at you and they say, oh, I'm busy, and then you don't know, you feel unwelcome in the class. Enough.
So we need to shout it from the rooftops. We are actually a do-ocracy.
Yeah, so for the conclusion, it's a problem specific to us. It is like this, the numbers I showed you, it is for open source a very, very condensed issue that is um, even more there than it is in general. It's also an opportunity because actually Ubuntu is the Linux for humans. And I think this is our strength. I think due to my experience here this weekend, to me, it's quite clear that Ubuntu is probably one of the better students in the open source class, but that doesn't mean we're there yet. 10% is appalling. I'm sorry. So diversity can actually be really good for us as a community, and the products we make, they can be smarter, they can be well thought out, they can be more sensitive to everyone. And it's really good for us because it means that we have all the tools to keep learning. I read somewhere that digital literacy is akin to reading and writing. And I was like, yeah, that makes complete sense. The well being of a human today is very closely connected to their ability to be digitally literate. Meritocracy can make this wall of entry worse. There is cultural factors, and it could be because you're a marginalized race, you're a marginalized sexuality, whatever makes it so that we feel ashamed of ourselves and unable to recognize our own strengths. And do-ocracy there, if we are very loud and explicit to it, like what you do, even if you're not sure about it, you're still adding, can be very empowering to this. We don't say you need to prove to us that you have had all of this education, that you have all of this time and background um, in this community for you to be important and to contribute in any way you want. It's speaking to your specific passions and really making it clear to the outside world, we will not gatekeep what the open source community should be. Because as you saw, Nathan said, I felt like I was not able to be the technical person I thought I had to be. But we're not going to say that Nathan isn't really valuable within our community. So it's very clear that we just have to be very explicit about you don't have to be anything, just try and feel that passion. So yeah, actually said it. We're already doing the do-ocracy, but I didn't know when I talked to people that were really into open source before I met all of you, and also before I met Merlijn, it was always like, oh, it's nothing for you. It doesn't make sense to you. And for some reason, I took that, I accepted that. Like, I thought, oh yeah, open source is probably too complex and I have nothing to add here. And then I came here, I was like, oh no, this is really interesting. I want to do so much. And I got really enthused. And I think we need to make that our strength. Let's make it very public that it's a do-ocracy and that we want to inspire and take inspiration and collaborate and build and not gatekeep. Okay, thanks. Yeah. So we had to cut out like a whole bunch of info. We didn't want to bore you with like 10,000 studies and texts, but actually the presentation will be available. And if you have a specific interest in anything we mentioned, there's probably a link in there. I would highly recommend the paper. I blush if I could. Closing gender divides in digital skills through education. It's more an education specific policy paper, but I think it is so applicable to any community. So yeah, definitely check the links out. And also for the blueprint, the hackerspace.design. Do you have any questions? Okay. I have a disability and
Okay.
I cannot throw things.
You can't throw things very far, but we could go ding, 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 ding. Thank you so much. This was exactly what I needed as a follow-up to my question in the community council. So a follow-up question from that. And I think specifically of Debian, which I think has a very different character to Ubuntu, and Debian is definitely a meritocracy with issues. All of these you listed. So how do we move from a meritocracy to a do-ocracy in a volunteer project? Any tips?
That's a very interesting question, and in a sense, I would actually say that we need to have a sort of hybrid, because I've talked about, for example, tearing a building down. Do-ocracy can't give you a mechanism to tear a building down because it's something that's not revertible. And so where we implemented do-ocracy in the past, it was always do-ocracy as the default system for how things get decided. And then for certain decisions, you need certain boards or authority boards in order to actually make those decisions. And so what I would actually say is that for the Ubuntu community specifically, like let's use the Ubuntu community as an example, I think that simply by saying that we are a do-ocracy and including that in our code of conduct, for example, that yes, some decisions are made using the structure of authority within the Ubuntu project, but there is also a very large part of do-ocracy. Simply by saying it, people will start to act like it and people will start to do it.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation. It made me curious when you're commenting on the fact that Ubuntu is a do-ocracy and we want to make it more clear so everybody contributes actively. Do you have any examples of blockers or difficulties contributing in this sense, coming from figures of authority or companies, or how do you see the need to push for this to be more public?
Do you need blockers do you mean blockers inside of the Ubuntu community or more general?
Yeah, what is the opposing force to this do-ocracy that we need to push for more strongly? Like, do you have examples of things that you have seen generally? I mean, not naming names, but just generally, what are the issues that we're addressing?
So this is the first time I've given this presentation, and this is actually the initiation of that idea. I think the next steps are, if there is interest in trying to actually implement it, and then see who those blockers are, see what we need to actually do. But yeah.
If I can give my complete subjective opinion, I think it is quite clear to me that even in the marketing, we have a bit of a discrepancy. I think when I go to the talks, I see there's already a very do-ocratic fake, the very do-ocratic, like, let's everybody join. We have the talk from Nathan, for example, which I found very inspiring and made me feel really welcome. It's not very clear from the general marketing, I would say. I've seen these marketings way before I knew anyone in the community, and it was very unclear to me that it was welcoming. And I think the welcoming idea and the public idea of this collaboration should be the first thing you see when you get in touch with Ubuntu, I think.
I also want to add one thing is that I think that in a community as large and as diverse as Ubuntu is right now, I think it's important to keep focusing on the positives, to keep focusing on finding agreement. And we can see that even if it's simply the advertisement, we can see that there's a lot of agreement on this. So let's focus on that, and let's try to actually see how we can ride that wave and implement that actually in a way that benefits us. There was another thing I wanted to say, but I think I forgot it already. Yeah.
I want to confirm the things you're saying. So there's a widespread belief that decisions in the Ubuntu desktop, who I'm more familiar with, that decisions, contributions, actions, etc., in the Ubuntu desktop are coming top down from Canonical. But that isn't my personal experience at all. I've been a long time member of the Ubuntu desktop community, and I've had substantial impact from being on the community side. So much that I joined Canonical a little less than 2 years ago, and I've done far more for the Ubuntu desktop before I joined Canonical than I've managed to do since then. Also, it's interesting that in the earlier part of your presentation, you pointed to barrier of entry as being a weakness of meritocracy. But it seems that barrier to entry still exists in do-ocracies. In my personal experience, it took me a while to find a place to do things because things were already being done, and it took so. This is an issue with trying to have some kind of on-ramp, trying to have some way for new people to come in. If the people making decisions are the people doing things, and everything's being done, then they're still not welcoming to new people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that is a separate track that I know a bunch of people are working on. For example, one of the things that we think might help is to have a more clear view of what your growth path might be as a contributor. To have a more clear view of these are the things you can do, very simple, small things to do as somebody who starts out in the community. And this is where how you can scale up in complexity, in investment, how you can scale up your contributions. And then these are the certain positions that you can earn as part of the achievements that you've gotten in order to have a more clear path forward. And to just go back to your question, I just remembered what I wanted to say. I think something that's very, very important to understand is that a lot of these systems that are causing lack of diversity, that are creating these big barriers of entry. A lot of these systems are being held into place because of people's blind sides, not because of people's malicious intent. And so this is something that, if you approach it in a positive manner, that a lot of people, even though they seemed to be not for certain changes, that are actually for certain changes because they were simply blind to it.
Yeah, actually, that's really interesting. I did a podcast earlier today, by surprise, and I had a quite similar question to that. And I do like to say systems, not people. But at the same time, I do feel like the data makes it very clear that we do contribute very high quality things as women. I'm speaking for me. Um, and to be honest, just the fact that we're doing less contributions is very telling towards where this energy is going. And just this passionate side gets sucked out of it when you try to keep um, telling yourself that something has to be perfect from the first try, which is a very like imposter syndrome kind of thought. If you keep telling yourself something has to be perfect or you will be called a dumb bitch, I don't know.
Mhm.
It's not a specific example. um, then all the fun gets lost. And for me, what I found is I thought I could not add anything. And then I was here this weekend and I had a great time with a lot of friendly people in the community. And I all of a sudden got ideas of things I could do that weren't being done because I found things I specifically was passionate about. So I think to like bridge a bit between those two, I think the opportunity of seeing something that you want to do and that is not being done is in a sense the do-ocracy telling you just do. It doesn't have to be good. It's fine to it to be bad. Somebody else can build on that and make it better.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with that. And I just want to add two short things. The one is that in my experience, a meritocracy makes you so focused on competence and seniority that you're scared to make mistakes. A do-ocracy seems, in other volunteer groups that I'm in, it seems that it's okay to make mistakes, and then you'll just do it over again. So I think that's where that sense comes from. And then the other thing I was thinking, generally when people say focus on the positive and just say we are do-ocracy, really irritates me because I'm like, oh, come on with your kumbaya. But I do think here it does have merit because it creates a precedent to gently then show people who, from their blind spots, not from their malice, how it could be done. So I just want to thank you for that as well.
Yeah, I do always get this weird pit in my stomach when I'm talking about like these injustices as women we sometimes face. Like we just have to try to be positive and just try to not blame men. And I'm always like, oh, I wasn't. But at the same time, there is something to it that there is this culture thing that made me so insecure unnecessarily. And I cannot speak for all women, but I do think it's something I recognize in so many of the most intelligent women I'm surrounded with. Like there is something there of perfectionism that is like expected. And that's not a pretty thing. That's not a fun thing. That's not a good thing. The only thing I can do is like make it a bit whimsy and have some fun and say, fuck you. Demonetization.
Hello. Just wanted to say that this was an amazing talk. And one of the things that I found as someone who's, came into open source in 2018 and was super nervous because when I looked at it, I'm just like, there are not a lot of women here. Holy crap, is this a space for me? And it's hard to kind of walk into that space with, all the other hangups like, could I do anything? But just thinking, should I even be here in the first place? And one of the things so many of the men in this community did was that we're glad you're here. what do you like doing? What do you want to do? And, one of the things was like, I started contributing to the Ubuntu Mate website, which meant I had to learn Git. And oh my God, I'm surprised I didn't crash our repository. But one of the guys was just so, he's like, okay, here's how you do it. Like you can do it, you can do the pull requests on the website if you're not comfortable on the CLI. And so I think so many of the men in this community can be amazing advocates and allies and cheerleaders. And that is something, and having more women visible in the community, that's part, but also having the men and people who are other, basically for other types of diversity to be, we're glad you're here. What do you like doing? And then also if people are like taking their ideas or doing stuff that's not going to make them welcome, just say it's like, hey, can we be a little more welcoming? So, and I just want to say that's something I think this community does well, but oh my gosh, like let's be more public about it. So exactly. Oh,
Thank you for your talk. I really liked it, and I hope to actually copy it, or some of it. I went to a gender and law conference in Gothenburg last week, and it was the least diverse place in the entire city by every metric. And I was wondering about applying a lot of the stuff that I see here, and even in this talk and in general in this conference, to a space, to other spaces outside of software that are will say similar things as long as the people they're criticizing aren't them. But how do you approach? Would you have any recommendations in general for approaching this type of stuff, like that you've done well? This is sort of successes. How you could recreate it in let's say other spaces? Like I'm doing a gender studies PhD, and it's problematic internally. So, yes, not necessarily I'm just if you did.
So if you talk about other types of organizations, I've actually worked together with some art collectives. Simply just giving this talk, removing any mention of hackerspaces and open source, and it works very well. So yeah, I was actually, I've bought do-ocracy.design and just rebrand the website to like do-ocracy.design, not hackerspace.design. But I think I don't think it needs a lot of change in order to adapt it to other communities, because it's very, if you read the booklet, for example, it's quite generically written.
I think we should actually talk because I might stray way too far. But I was working within a very diverse community for sex workers' rights. And that's a very touchy subject with a very diverse in economical class, in race, in sexuality, everything group. And for some reason, every time we had to talk policy, the room would all of a sudden become very one-sided. And I was usually one of the only women left in the room. And I had to talk about these things and also try to get some change within that and within our own community. So I think that's really interesting, and we should definitely get back to that. I do recommend the Hackerspace site, like Merlijn said. It's very applicable to all types of organizations. And I would also suggest the paper, the policy paper. It is written by the UN and the German Economic for Equality. German. But and the organization equality, and I think it's definitely about specifically tech and education, but it is very broad in that sense. It's very applicable and it gives some really good pointers.